all separated 6 feet apart, and every precaution has been taken to ensure the safety of this broadcast.
Your local election headquarters is airing this debate live on WPRI 12 and WPRI.com, as well as our Nexstar sister stations in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Albany, New York, which covers the Berkshire County region. It is also being carried live on the website of Gannett's Massachusetts Publications. And as Ted said, Gannett and UMass Dartmouth are our debate partners, and later in the evening, we'll get a question from the Chancellor of UMass Dartmouth and a top editor for the Gannett Southeastern Massachusetts newspapers. Those questions will be via video.
Now to the candidates and the debate. Ed Markey has represented Massachusetts in the United States Senate since 2013. Prior to that, he had represented the 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House since 1976. Mr. Markey attended Boston College and BC Law School. Joe Kennedy has represented Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District since 2013. Prior to that, he was an assistant district attorney from 2009 to 2012. Mr. Kennedy attended Stanford University and Harvard Law School.
Now, both candidates will have the opportunity to give a 1-minute closing statement, the order of which was determined by a coin toss. Mr. Markey, Mr. Kennedy, as you both know, there is no strict format to tonight's debate. We're looking for an open and honest discussion of the issues. But if Ted or I feel like you're taking too long or you're not answering the question, we're going to jump in. And Mr. Markey, we're going to begin with you for the first question. As America continues to see protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, it once again shines a light on disparities in the criminal justice system. Mr. Markey, as a congressman in 1994, you voted for a Get Tough on Crime bill that created a more punitive criminal justice system. A disparate number of black Americans make up the country's prison population, and experts have said that law played a role. Do you now regret supporting that bill?
Thank you for hosting this debate this evening. Every member of the Massachusetts delegation voted for that crime bill, every member. That included a ban on assault weapons. It included the institution of the Violence Against Women's Act. Very important changes. It also had in it sentencing guidelines that were totally wrong and have to be changed. And from my perspective, we have to ensure that we correct that. But let me also say this, that when Congressman Kennedy became a lawyer, he decided to go to work for the most conservative Republican right-wing district attorney in Massachusetts in a generation. The prosecutor that Joe Kennedy worked for was someone who did not believe that 3 strikes and you're out is strong enough, did not believe in the legalization of marijuana, constantly prosecuted the most minor of drug offenses, and Congressman Kennedy had to decide where he was going to work as a lawyer. And I don't think it was good judgment, especially as we look at New Bedford and Fall River, and we can see these voices that are being raised up against the status quo in the criminal justice system in our country. I don't think it was good judgment for Congressman Kennedy to go to work for that right-wing Republican district attorney.
Why don't we have you weigh in here, Mr. Kennedy? He's talking about Cape and Island's District Attorney, Michael O'Keefe. He has been an outspoken critic of the criminal justice reform. As he points out, when you left Harvard Law School, you could have worked for anybody, but you chose a Republican district attorney. Why him?
I'm not sure it could have worked for anybody, but I appreciate it. But first off, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this debate. Look, I spent my first couple of years as a prosecutor learning our criminal justice system. And I actually, when I went to work with Michael O'Keefe, of course, we had big differences of agreement. He was a Republican district attorney who hired a guy named Kennedy to go in as an entry-level prosecutor. We, of course, had disagreements. I find it a little surprising, though, given what Senator Markey's stance has been on the need for what he says about criminal justice reform, that he's now actually advocating to say that you shouldn't have progressive prosecutors work in offices. Of course, that's the change we want to see. We celebrate now progressive prosecutors actually using their own experiences, their judgment, their determination on how cases should be.
But didn't you help campaign against a progressive prosecutor with DA Rollins, who is now the Suffolk County DA? You chose her opponent in a primary. She obviously won out on that. At what point do your actions and your words conflict?
So, Ted, thanks for letting me clarify on that. Tim, excuse me. Thank you. Apologies. Thank you for letting me clarify on that. I didn't endorse in that race. Yes, I go back with one of the individuals in that race, Greg Henning, a long way. but I didn't endorse in that race, and Senator Markey didn't either. So I think what's critical to understand at this moment, when our nation has been wrestling with the wounds that go back decades, if not centuries, is what have we done to try to address it? And let me be clear about this. My own record on this, no one has done enough. Have I done enough? No. Has Senator Markey? No. But the difference is, since I came into Congress, I've been deliberate about trying to tackle those challenges and racial disparities, whether it was one of the first bills I passed on education, whether it's bills I filed to actually address the way in which wrongful death cases are calculated and amounts are calculated, whether it gets to maternal mortality, and whether it gets to access to a lawyer. The difference here, Tim, is that this isn't just a question of Senator Markey's vote for a 1994 crime bill, but the long-standing record of judgment that he's shown. When he came into office, he actually opposed the integration of the Boston public school system. And again, it's not just those positions, it's the fact that there hasn't been a deliberate effort to actually address those structural challenges that he helped codify into law.
Mr. Markey, I'll give you 30 seconds to respond.
No, thank you. Yeah. So it just comes back to Congressman Kennedy's judgment, his choice. He could have worked for anyone. He could have worked for the Innocence Project. He could have worked as a tenants' rights attorney. But instead, he decided to go and work for a right-wing Republican who opposes the kinds of progressive changes that we're looking for. That was a choice which Congressman Kennedy made with his legal career. That's who he worked for. That was not the right place for a progressive to be working.
Do you want to respond to his charge from the 1970s?
If I may, and moreover, in this race, Rachel Rollins, the district attorney of Suffolk County, is endorsing me because I partner with her in advocating for the kind of criminal justice reform that our country needs. And I'm very proud of having Rachel Rollins' support because she is the embodiment of the kind of change which we need, the kind of progressive leadership which we need. And today, we are partnering together. That's the kind of progressive leadership for the future that we need in the criminal justice system, and I'm very proud of her support in this race.
Congressman, 30 seconds. Please.
Senator, I'm glad to see that you're paying attention to these issues now. You've been in office for 47 years at the state system and the federal system. You were in the House for nearly 40 years, and you've been in the Senate for 7. The images that we see across our television screens, those protests and demonstrations that we have attended, I was in Chelsea yesterday. We marched through the streets with District Attorney Rollins and then held a moment of silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I never knew that 8 minutes and 46 seconds could last so long. To think of a man gasping for his breath and calling for his mother. And the fact is that what we see playing out on our streets today is the fact that we are right here where we were, which is not all that different from where we were 50 years ago in 1968. And we have not made any progress because the laws and the structures that have been come down as a boot on the neck of communities of color, those are not an accident. They were deliberate, they were intentional, and they came in by choice. And you might be known for some things in your time in office, Senator. Racial justice and criminal justice is not one of them.
All right.
Oh, let me just go. I have to answer that. I have to answer that. Look, Congressman Kennedy had a chance to sign on to Medicare for All when it was introduced. I stood with Bernie Sanders to fight for health care for everyone. Medicare for all. It took Congressman Kennedy 2 years to sign on to Medicare for all. That's not progressive leadership. Congressman Kennedy decided he was going to work for a right-wing Republican district attorney. That's not progressive leadership. Congressman Kennedy decided that he was going to vote to send military weapons to the local police in our country. That's not progressive leadership. Congressman Kennedy had a chance when he gave the State of the Union response to Donald Trump to talk about climate change. Congressman Kennedy did not mention the word climate change in his response. Congressman Kennedy is a progressive in name only. When he gets a chance to lead on Medicare for all, on climate change, on the militarization of the streets of this country, he was not a progressive leader. And when he had to make a decision as to who he was going to work for as a lawyer, he decided to work as a lawyer for a right-wing Republican. That is not the kind of progressive leadership which our country needs desperately right now.
Let me wrap up the criminal justice section of this conversation with a final question. I'm looking for a quick answer on this. And Mr. Markey, I'll direct it to you first. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently supported the Defund the Police movement and advocated for funneling money from law enforcement to social service programs. Do you agree with her?
We have to restructure our balance between the criminal justice system and the funding for education, for health care, for job opportunities in our society. Yes, it is absolutely critical that we stop this school to prison pipeline that we have in our country, and that we fund the kinds of programs that young people of color need in our country in order to make sure that they can maximize their God-given abilities.
Do you fund those programs by pulling money from police departments? That's the question.
I think that we have to reallocate the budget. Yes, we need a rebalancing of the budget between policing and healthcare and education and other opportunities. It is time for us to have that debate and to effectuate those changes in our society. And I think that's what everyone in New Bedford and Fall River who are out every single night are saying to us.
Mr. Kennedy, brief response, please.
I think we have to totally reform the way that we police in this country. And that does mean going to our budgets and reallocating those budgets and making sure that we fund not just the mechanisms necessary to keep people safe, but mental and behavioral health services. It means making sure that you've got folks that are trained to make sure you're addressing the root causes of this and not continue to just put people in jail.
Okay.
Mr. Kennedy, let's turn to a question for you here. A lot of this has been about who can be a better senator from Massachusetts. The University of Virginia has ranked all members of Congress for their effectiveness, and during the 115th Congress, you had a lower score than Mr. Markey, and the second lowest score in the Massachusetts congressional delegation. If they think you're not being effective in your current job, why should you get a promotion?
Ted, so a couple things. One, trying to pass major pieces of legislation when you've spent the entire time in the minority is more difficult to do in the House of Representatives, which is where I spent my first 3 terms in office. What I will say is there's a difference, though, between your ability to file the right bill and get the vote and understanding the obstacles to change to actually bring about the progressive change that I want to see, which is why I was in nearly 20 states last cycle helping to flip the House. It's why I went campaigning from West Virginia to Indiana to Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, doing exactly what Senator Warren and Senator Sanders have done. Go out there and try to build a movement so that when we actually reclaim the House, not only could you hold this administration accountable through impeachment, but you could cast votes like as an assault or like background checks and campaign finance reform and government reform and the Paycheck Fairness Act and the Equality Act. That's what needs to happen. And the fact is that when you compare my record about going out and actually trying to actually create the change that is necessary, I was in all those states. Senator Markey was in 0.
But Mr. Kennedy, when you talking to voters as we got ready for this debate, I kept hearing, I'm not exactly sure why Joe Kennedy is running because it seems like they're going to vote the same way on a lot of things. Is there something more concrete you can point to for voters about the difference if they switch senators this fall?
The difference is literally in how we define the job. I believe there's a lot more to this, to being a senator from Massachusetts than just voting the way that you vote and the bills that you cast. And if you want something concrete on that, let's dive in on into criminal justice. It is not just a question that Senator Markey voted for that crime bill, as we talked about before. And it's not just a question of the fact that he opposed the integration of Boston public schools when he came into office. It's a question of what have you done to actually rectify those decisions after you made them. And the fact is that Senator Markey might be known for several things in office. Criminal justice and racial equity is not one of them.
Let me turn to Mr. Markey. Senator Markey, the Green New Deal has been obviously a major thing you've discussed throughout your campaign. You're co-sponsoring that with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. You'll need Republican support for the Green New Deal to get it through the Senate. You need 60 votes. Out of 250 senators who served in the last quarter century, the Lugar Center ranks you in the bottom 10 for bipartisan legislation, lower than Elizabeth Warren, lower than Ted Kennedy. Why should voters believe one of the most partisan senators in the nation will be able to get Republicans on board and actually pass the Green New Deal?
Because leadership requires bipartisanship. I have 580 laws on the books, and I needed a Republican every time to get them passed. I'm in the top 5 in the Senate in terms of effectiveness. I took on the oil industry and the auto industry to increase the fuel economy standards of the vehicles in our country. That's the single greatest reduction in greenhouse gases of any law in the history of the world. That's my law. I took on the NRA to ensure that we did not have Chinese assault weapons coming into America, to make sure that the CDC could do, for the first time, the research on the causes of gun violence in our society. They're both laws. They're my laws. I took on Wall Street on insider trading. That is the law that takes on Wall Street. That's my law.
The Green New Deal is at the center of your campaign this year, and you've been the leader now in the last decade or so on the biggest climate bills out there. There was Waxman-Markey, and now there's the Green New Deal. In both cases, as we stand here today, you've not been able to pass those. So why should voters have confidence in a new term you'd actually be able to get a big climate bill across the threat, not just talk about it, but get it into law?
Well, because when the telecommunications giants were monopolies, I broke them up. I broke them up. It's my law that unleashed the broadband revolution in this country. No one had that on the scoreboard. I did that. When Alzheimer's reached a point where 5 million Americans had it, I got the law passed in 2014 so that we would find and fund the cure for Alzheimer's by the year 2025. That is the law right now. And back in 2007 on the fuel economy standards, I had to find a bipartisan way of getting that done, and it passed. And the same thing is true, by the way, for appliance efficiency. The Constitution for appliance efficiency, for the air conditioning in this room, for the heating, for the lighting, that's all my law to reduce dramatically the greenhouse gases. They're all my laws. They all passed. They were all bipartisan because I worked across the aisle to get big things done. The congressman has been in office for 8 years at this point, and we are still waiting for a major piece of legislation to be passed by the congressman that merits his promotion to the United States Senate.
I'll let you respond.
So the senator has a very interesting definition of winning. He said he took on the oil industry. Maybe that's why a board member of ExxonMobil contributed to the senator's campaign, as multiple fossil fuel people involved in the fossil fuel industry continue to do in violation of the senator's own pledge, which he only returns after he is notified about it. He says that he's taken on the gun industry. Senator, 100 people die every single day from gun violence in this country. I am a father of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. I try to visit preschools for my daughter, and we have to run through active shooter drills for what happens if somebody walks into that school with a gun. That doesn't sound like winning to me. We say that you filed a bill to cure Alzheimer's. That's not how curing Alzheimer's works. If that were the way it works, we could end racism today by filing a bill to end racism. That's not how this is done. This is done by building coalitions and changing minds. And the challenge that the senator has is when it came to his seminal pieces of legislation, that cap and trade bill, they couldn't get it across the finish line because you know who objected to it? Groups like Greenpeace and organized labor, core Democratic constituencies that were not there at the table when they needed to be. And because of that, we are still where we are today, all of these years later, and we still don't have the progress that our generation needs.
Mr. Markey, I'll give you 30 seconds, but then we have to move on.
ExxonMobil bitterly opposes the Green New Deal that Alexandria Ocasio and I have introduced because it's an existential threat to their business model. The NRA, I passed that law just in December, 5 months ago, to have research done at the CDC for the first time in history to find the causes of gun violence in our society. And by the way, on Alzheimer's, the congressman could not be more wrong. Research is medicine's field of dreams from which we harvest the findings that give hope to families that they could find that Alzheimer's ever existed. That's what my program does. It's going to be a $20 to $30 billion program to find the cure for Alzheimer's, and research is the key, as it is in every single disease.
All right, gentlemen, we have to go to a question now from one of our debate partners, UMass Dartmouth. Here now is the Chancellor of UMass Dartmouth, Dr. Robert Johnson.
Welcome, Senator Markey and Congressman Kennedy, to UMass Dartmouth. We are so excited about this debate. I want to thank you for participating. We thought that we would be doing this face-to-face, in person, but in light of this global pandemic, we're doing it virtually. In the midst of COVID-19, college students within the Commonwealth, on our campus, and all across the country have been severely impacted financially, in terms of health disparities, families losing their jobs. And as you know, we had to start teaching remotely this past semester. As we go forward and as we think about higher education and the support that the families will need in order to earn their college degrees. What will each of you do to ensure that college students have the support that they need financially and in any other way to complete their college degree?
Thank you, Dr. Robert Johnson from UMass Dartmouth, and Mr. Markey will direct his question to you.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't empathize more with the students in this era. I was a commuter to college, a commuter to law school. I lived home with my father, drove a truck for the Hood Milk Company in Malden. So I know what it's like to have a knapsack of student debt on your back. That was my life. I had to live it. And I know how hard it is for young people today because the debt today is far greater than it ever was when I was young. So I believe that as part of the coronavirus relief package, we should actually just forgive right up the top $10,000 of all the student debt of all the students across the country. And we should institute a program in which we long-term just forgive it for students up to $100,000 worth of debt, because we need to say to these young people, we know how tough this existence is going to be in the Depression era like conditions that you're going to be living and working in. And I think that we have to guarantee to them that we're going to relieve them of that burden, and we're going to open up, and this is where the Green New Deal would come in, because if we get a Green New Deal, it's going to create millions of new jobs that are going to give the opportunities to this current generation of young people to move out and to deploy that energy system that is going to save the planet and at the same time create those millions of new jobs for them to be able to work.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Mr. Kennedy?
One, we need to make sure that we have debt-free college in this country. We need to make sure that college, I've signed onto legislation to ensure that we wipe out student debt for 95% of all borrowers. And the reason why it's 95% is I don't think for folks that can afford it that other taxpayers should be paying for my kids' education. But understand that here's where I think what Senator Markey said is actually quite important. Our government at this point is putting the burden of an education on the backs of students to get a middle-class job for the first time in our history. And he's right about one thing. The deck is stacked more against students today than it ever has been before. So if that's the case, how can we possibly say that folks that have been in office for 50 years are doing right by a younger generation? We are not addressing the systemic challenges that we are now putting on a younger generation to address these challenges. And obviously the cost of college and higher education is one of them. But if you talk to leaders of higher education, like the Chancellor, they'll also tell you, particularly for this generation in this moment, the need for access to mental behavioral health care, which has been one of my area of core focus since I got to Congress. And it's where we've been working with colleges and universities to try to actually scale up and spread out access to access to mental health care for our students.
All right, I want to do a rapid fire section now. We're looking for just 1 or 2 word answers here, and I'll start with Mr. Markey, and then I'll alternate the order on each question. But again, please be brief. We want to cover a lot of ground here. So, Mr. Markey, do you support or oppose term limits for U.S. senators?
I do not. Elections are the term limits.
And Mr. Kennedy?
Oppose.
Mr. Kennedy, do you support or oppose abolishing the Electoral College?
Support.
Mr. Markey?
100% abolition.
Senate rule called a filibuster usually means 60 votes are needed to pass most bills. Yes or no, should the Senate filibuster be abolished?
If we can't get 60 votes in the Senate after a landslide this year, then abolish the filibuster.
Mr. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Kennedy, do you support or oppose the Mashpee Wampanoag's plan to build a casino in Taunton?
Support.
And Mr. Markey?
Support.
And what about the Wampanoag tribe in Aquinnah? Do you support their efforts to build a casino on Martha's Vineyard? Mr. Markey?
Yes, I do.
You do. And Mr. Kennedy?
Tribal rights are tribal rights, yes.
Okay, Ted?
Gentlemen, as we stand here tonight, the unemployment rate in New Bedford is 24%. That is the second highest jobless rate in the Commonwealth outside of the Cape and Islands. Mr. Markey, New Bedford, as you know, is the most successful commercial fishing port in the country, and for a number of years now, city leaders have been pushing to move the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Fisheries Science Center to New Bedford from Woods Hole. Do you support or oppose that?
Well, I think that has to be something that perhaps winds up with a shared facility, that we do it in both places, that we expand in New Bedford, ensure at the same time that Woods Hole can stay there as this historic facility which we have always been relying upon.
You received letters in 2016 and 2018. You were CC'd on them from New Bedford leaders about this. I mean, it sounds like there's still not a concrete plan for what you think should happen with that. Have you given it much thought?
I have given it a lot of thought, and I do believe there can be a shared responsibility. By the way, I would throw in UMass Dartmouth as well, because they have a wonderful program as well. We can find a way, especially as we're going to be expanding what we're doing out in the ocean. Because of a request from Mayor John Mitchell of New Bedford, I was able to secure $15 million so that we could have a staging area for wind to be deployed off the coastline and 60 new berths for commercial fishermen. So we're going to need an expanded view of our region and how we're going to be using the ocean. And I think Woods Hole, New Bedford, UMass Dartmouth can all be a part of that coalition.
Mr. Kennedy, same question. Do you support or oppose New Bedford leaders on moving that NOAA facility to New Bedford?
I think the opportunity that we have here in the southeast, southeastern Massachusetts and South Coast, is actually building a blue and green economy. And this is where I've worked actually quite closely with Congressman David Cicilline to actually align our institutions and federal policy to support what's already taking place here. And that means we've worked very closely with University of Rhode Island, with UMass Dartmouth, with some of the other institutions that we have here to actually scale up and then flush out that plan. So from Mass Maritime to the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Rhode Island to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to the robotics companies that are actually working on underwater robotics and harvesting of underwater resources. We have this enormous opportunity and potential if we align federal policy to support those efforts, and that certainly can be part of it.
There is a potential pitfall. I mean, people in Falmouth might be concerned if they hear even sharing between Woods Hole and New Bedford. What do you say to folks there?
I say that we have to break down this idea that somehow we're going to make Woods Hole compete against New Bedford. There is so much opportunity here to make sure we actually are additive and not pitting one part against the other. And that, quite frankly, has gone on for far too long in southeastern Massachusetts. We have the opportunity here to actually look, to zoom out, look beyond the parochial nature of this, and look to the assets that we have on the Cape Cod Community College, for instance, the assets that we have in Rhode Island, the assets that we even have in Connecticut with Electric Boat, and actually build a regional economy here that can be transformative. And that's also why I work with Congressman Cicilline to create a regional economic zone here that can actually gain support from federal dollars.
All right, now we want to go to another question from one of our debate partners at the Gannett newspapers of Massachusetts. Here's a video question from one of Gannett's editors.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Hyman. I'm an editor at the Enterprise in Brockton, which has the second highest rate of coronavirus in the state, as well as a large immigrant population. Some local officials and activists have told us that sometimes immigrants continue to work even if they're sick because they don't qualify for unemployment benefits and have no other way to put food on the table. Would you support a temporary unemployment benefit for undocumented immigrants as a way to slow the spread of the virus? And if not, how would you address this issue?
Rebecca Hyman from the Gannett newspapers, thank you very much. So, Mr. Kennedy, she's asking about a temporary unemployment benefit for undocumented immigrants during the pandemic. How do you respond?
Yes. Look, you're not going to solve a pandemic by forcing people in our country to go to work and enable them to spread it. The whole point on a pandemic is that your health and well-being is linked to mine. And we need to make sure that we have the policies in place to allow for individuals who are sick to be able to get well and get healthy and not transmit the virus. Yes.
How far are you willing to go with this principle, Mr. Kennedy? Rebecca's question was focused on the pandemic. Should undocumented immigrants be eligible for federal SNAP benefits outside the coronavirus, like unemployment, Medicaid, and SNAP?
Yes.
You can hear people at home right now going, but they're not in this country, they're undocumented, and that to a lot of people will seem unfair.
And many undocumented still pay taxes, and their well-being is linked to ours. Yes.
All right, Mr. Markey, Rebecca's question to you, she was asking about unemployment benefits during the pandemic for undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, and this is a big issue and something that, you know, I talked to Mayor Bob Sullivan up in Brockton about, and it's this immigrant community, the need for them to get the kind of care they need at their medical institutions, at their community health centers. And I've been partnering with him and the city to make sure they got the resources which they needed. And on the question of giving benefits to these undocumented, from my perspective, that's what the goal was of Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Bernie Sanders when we introduced our bill to give $2,000 to each individual. For a couple, it would be $4,000. If they had a child, $6,000, so that they would have a way on a recurring basis, month after month, to get that check to make it through this incredible
You mean in another round of
crisis that we're in.
stimulus?
And we made sure, very clearly, that any undocumented immigrant that paid taxes would qualify for that program. Because that was the core of what Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders and I want to accomplish with this program, and we're going to fight very hard in this next round of a debate with Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump on the floor of the United States Senate to make sure that that program becomes a reality for undocumented immigrants.
Mr. Kennedy.
I think folks need to read the fine print of Mr. Markey's legislation, because he has far more faith in the Trump administration than I do. The bill that he's authored lasts for 3 months, after which after the Secretary of Health and Human Services deems there is no longer a public health emergency. So, Senator, maybe you have far more faith in Secretary Azar than I do, but I don't trust this administration with anything when it comes to this virus. They lie about it literally every day.
This public health crisis is going to go on for months, maybe years. And that was the goal that Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and I had.
But it doesn't mean the Secretary is going to say that.
It was to make sure that there would be coverage for every family until it was over. And yeah, I don't deny that Donald Trump is a serial liar, a racist, but at the same time, there will be no objective analysis that would be able to conclusively say that the pandemic is over, and it would be impossible as a result for our program to be stopped. There would be a firestorm in our country if all of a sudden the president decides it's over. And so I look forward to that debate. I look forward to him trying to take away $2,000 per individual at the height of a pandemic that's caused a Great Depression level unemployment crisis in our country. That's the kind of debate, actually, that Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders and I want on this issue.
Why did you give the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Trump administration the authority to actually regulate that program?
Look, we're in a pandemic. We're in a Great Depression. We have both going on at the same time. This piece of legislation is something that's giving hope to families across the country that they will have the New Deal-like relief which they deserve,
Senator,
the FDR moment.
Senator,
and
if that's the
ultimately,
case,
it will be, honestly, it's going to be impossible, even for Trump, to contend that the crisis is over when thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, are still dying every single month.
Senator, there were hundreds of people protesting and demonstrating outside the White House. He used the helicopters and tear gas to move them out so he could take a photo op. I don't trust him for anything on this. You could have done what we did in my direct cash payments bill, which we introduced months before you did, which was peg it to the unemployment rate. Peg it to some objective measure on healthcare rather than giving the Secretary of HHS the discretion, because I don't trust anyone in this administration with facts.
Listen, I can tell you one thing. Bernie Sanders does not trust Donald Trump. Kamala Harris does not trust Donald Trump. I don't trust Donald Trump. Okay, we know what we're doing. We know how to legislate, and we also know of the political impossibility of what will happen if he tries to declare that the pandemic is over when it's not. Look what happened to him when he decided to walk across the street from the White House to that church and to militarize. The pushback came from every general. The pushback came from ordinary citizens all across the country, and the same thing will happen if this president with the highest prevarication coefficient in history tries to pretend that the pandemic is over. He will get pushed back by Tony Fauci, by every public health doctor, and by the way, by a high percentage of the Republican Party as well, who know that this man cannot be trusted either to deploy the military or to determine when a pandemic has been completed.
Final thought, Mr. Kennedy, 30 seconds.
He still did it.
That's less than 30 seconds. And I think we both established you don't like Donald Trump. I want to stay on the pandemic for a moment here. Look, we've been hearing from a lot of viewers on this issue, and I want you both to weigh in on this. Protesters have taken to the street, often shoulder to shoulder. At the same time, elected officials, especially in blue states, have been preaching strict social distancing rules. What do you say to people who were barred from holding a funeral for a loved one or from seeing a family member in a nursing home, even if they were on their deathbed, but are hearing elected officials like yourselves now suddenly support mass gatherings?
I was one of those folks that could not attend a funeral. And I would not wish that on anyone. The personal cost that has now been affecting not just the 110,000 or so families that lost a loved one to this virus, but the untold thousands more that just passed away during this time. It's excruciating. Our nation has also seen wounds that go back from our earliest days come about yet again. And that sickness also needs to heal. That wound needs sunlight and air. And what we have seen on those streets are individuals in anguish and in pain and anger, the likes of which, look, I will never know. I recognize that for some, they have been denied a critical moment in their lives to have closure with a loved one. I also recognize the moment that this nation is in and the collective healing that needs to happen.
Mr. Markey?
My message is that what happened to George Floyd and his family is absolutely tragic. To have a man murdered, have a brother, a father, a son murdered, requires the level of response which we're seeing in our country. The soul of our country is on fire. The buildings were smoldering, but the soul of our country was on fire. And I think all across our country, people need a way to respond. So last Friday night when I was in New Bedford, as they stood to commemorate George Floyd's life and so many others who have lost their lives, they socially distanced and commemorated those lives.
But you know that's not happening everywhere, Mr.
Well,
Markey. And if in a week or two from now there's a spike in cases, was it still worth it?
Well, I was in Somerville last night for 8 minutes and 47 seconds kneeling. I was over at UMass Boston for 8 minutes and 46 seconds kneeling. I've been going to these demonstrations, and for the most part, people are self-distancing. Yeah, there are some who are not. So I would recommend to people that they socially distance and simultaneously fight the systemic racism that's built into our criminal justice, education, healthcare, and economic system. Just laced with it. But I think we don't have to make the choice at this time. As long as people socially distance, that's irresponsible for people to have gatherings that don't do that, because we will see a spike. But at the same time, it would also be irresponsible not to be out on the street and not to be standing up for the justice which all of these families are calling for all across our country.
Mr. Kennedy.
I'm not going to call the 55,000 people that showed up at Franklin Park on Tuesday afternoon in anguish and in pain to try to get their government's attention after decades, if not centuries, of ignoring their pleas for help. I'm not going to call that irresponsible.
Ted?
Mr. Markey, let's talk about change in this election. When you first ran for Congress, you were 29 years old. You represented youth, a fresh perspective after Watergate. You're now 73. You've spent more than half your life in Washington, and in fact, baby boomers still control more than half of Massachusetts seats in Congress. Why should your generation still have such outsized influence after being in power for quite a while?
Because it's really all about the age of your ideas. When I introduced the Green New Deal with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it changed the entire debate in the United States and, by the way, in the world on the climate crisis. It made it something that was above the fold and is now one of the top 3 issues in the presidential election. Or it was until these 2 new crises were just introduced into the discussion. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that Ed Markey is the generational change which we need in our country. And it's not just because of the Green New Deal, it's because of my leadership on net neutrality. It's because of my leadership on immigration laws. It's because of my leadership on gun safety laws. On each and every one of the major issues that are the forward-looking issues that have to be debated in our country, I have been a generational leader. It's the age of your ideas that are important. And all issues are about the future. And that's what I fight for. Looking ahead and leading the way, fighting and winning on the big issues. That's what my partnership with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is all about. The planet's dangerously warming. We can deploy a renewable energy revolution that creates millions of jobs and simultaneously deal with the frontline inequities, deal with minorities who have been left out, and to do it with social justice that our country demands at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Let me bring it. Mr. Kennedy, you're 39, but other than your age, it is hard for some voters to see you as a symbol of change. You're a straight white male. You come from a privileged family that's held Massachusetts seats in Congress for nearly 75 years. Can you really argue it's a sign of change to vote for a Kennedy in Massachusetts?
Absolutely, because what you heard from Senator Markey, in fact, was the articulation of a Green New Deal. I support it. I was on it from day one. That's great, and it's an important marker to set down. It is a House resolution that has not passed. But you know what has passed? A whole bunch of bills that he voted for that are saddling our generation of Americans, and will for decades to come. An Iraq war that still to this day sends young men and women to Iraq and the Middle East to fight for war when they were not even alive when the towers came down. And has cost us trillions of dollars. We talked about $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. You could pay that over multiple times and still have money left over to actually invest in some of the infrastructure and educational needs for this country. In Massachusetts, early childhood education costs more than tuition at the University of Massachusetts. It costs more to raise a kid from birth to 5 than to send them to college. We are facing massive structural inequities. For a generation, my generation, the generation behind me, they came out ready to work and faced the toughest economic job prospects a decade ago that they'd had in a generation. And now they're facing another one. At a certain point, how much worse does it have to get? When we have to do active shooter drills at schools, when you're looking at $1.7 trillion of student loan debt, when you're looking at the environmental policies that we talked about, but still to this day, have not, the last transformative piece of environmental legislation that was signed into law was signed by Richard Nixon.
But Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Markey clearly has found, even if there were some votes in the past that quite a few progressives dislike, now he's on the Green New Deal, and they say, he's got religion on some of this stuff. I know you disagree on that characterization, Mr. Markey, but you know what I mean, that the Markey of 2020, they're okay with.
And there's so much more to this than the bills you file and the votes you cast. If that's the case, look, Mitch McConnell doesn't care how great a Green New Deal is, how perfect that legislation is. He's not bringing it up for vote. He actually did on that one. The entire Senate voted present. But put that aside for a second. You are not going to get a single vote on the Green New Deal or any of the other progressive challenges that Senator Markey lays out unless Mitch McConnell is sent packing. And look, I went around the country campaigning to flip the House, which is why we actually were able to hold this administration accountable through impeachment, which is how we passed background checks and the Equality Act and paycheck fairness. And the list goes on and on and on. Senator Markey was in 0 other states last cycle.
Mr. Markey, 30 seconds and then we'll move on.
Thank you. Yeah, again, we're just coming back to what real progressive leadership looks like. When Bernie Sanders and I introduced Medicare for All in 2017, Congressman Kennedy did not sign up. It took him 2 years to sign up. What did he do in the weeks after we introduced that bill in 2017? He went to Detroit to a Crane's Business Council, and when asked about Medicare for All, he analyzed its prospects. And what he said was, even if we had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, he didn't think Medicare for All could ever pass. He said it was better to just think about incremental change. That's not leadership. That's not vision. That's not standing up and fighting for what you believe in. That's how you get the votes. That's what I do on environmental issues.
Well,
I
Mr.
stand
Kennedy,
up and I fight to make sure that we get the votes. And by the way, when he said that there's been no major environmental laws passed since 1970, well, Superfund, I'm the co-author of that law. That's 1980.
You've litigated that one before. So respond on the health care issue, and then we are going to move on.
So a couple things. One, the Medicare for All bill was filed for 13 years in the House before Senator Markey signed on to it. I didn't sign on to the initial version of that bill because it had things like obstacles for women to access abortion and didn't include long-term care. The reasons, Senator, that I didn't sign on to that bill were very clear. I talked about them openly. It sounds like you saw the actual speech or part of it. I wasn't going to sign on to a bill that put obstacles so women couldn't get access to an abortion. I talked to Privilege Jayapal about those obstacles. I worked with her, she addressed them, and I signed on to the legislation. That's
right,
actually how that works.
Thank you.
20 seconds
Thank
this
you.
time,
I
and then we're going to
appreciate
go to
it.
Tim.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders and I and Elizabeth Warren, we signed up in 2017. That's leadership. That's vision. That's fighting for what you believe in. It took 2 years for Congressman Kennedy to sign up. And by the way, at the Crane's business conference, he assessed its chances and said that it had no prospects of even passing if we controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate with Democrats. That's not
right, that's 20
leadership.
seconds that we
That's not
promised, Mr.
vision.
Markey.
You have to fight if you want to make fundamental change in our country.
Mr. Kennedy, you have criticized your opponent for not signing on to the People's Pledge, which seeks to end third-party spending from PACs in the race. A campaign that benefits would be penalized. We now know a PAC may come into the race to support your campaign. If this issue is so important to you, why don't you do a self-People's Pledge and take the hit the pledge requires, even though your opponent didn't sign on to it?
I rejected the money. I went public the moment that press report
They
came
can
out.
still spend it, Mr. Kennedy, if they wanted
I told them not to. I went public and said, I don't want the money, I don't need the money, and I don't
What if they do
didn't ask
spend
for the
it?
money.
Will your campaign take a financial hit if they do spend that money?
Tim, the issue here is that the pledge that I have proposed is the exact same pledge that Senator Markey ran on 6 years ago. Ran on it. This is why change doesn't happen. Because you have progressive leaders that say these great things, and then when it comes down to it, they compromise on their principles. There is no chance for anybody out there that thinks that you're going to be able to deliver on the promise of a Green New Deal or any transformative environmental change. The fossil fuel industry will always outspend you. That's the point of the People's Pledge. That's why he signed on to it, until he didn't. This is coming from a guy that ended up taking a contribution from a board member of ExxonMobil. And if you think that that's not, that is somehow excusable, then also understand that my lifetime rating with the League of Conservation Voters is actually higher than Senator Markey's. I am not the obstacle to environmental change in this race.
But what if
What he
another
could do
PAC
is
comes in,
take
Mr.
that
Kennedy?
$200,000 that came in from that super PAC and give it to the Sarah Gideon who's running against Susan Collins, because she
I
is far
hear
more
you.
likely to block that progressive change
But you
than
still
I
haven't
am.
answered my question. And the question on the table is, would you allow your campaign to take a hit if another PAC came from the outside?
And I've rejected that money, Tim. I've told them not to
So
spend
no.
it. I've told them not to spend it. I don't want it. I don't need it. And to donate it, I told them to donate that money to Black Lives Matter. I don't expect any way that money comes in. I told them not to, and I challenged the senator to do the same, and we haven't heard a thing from him.
Mr. Markey, Mr. Kennedy says you broke your promise from 2013.
Yeah, we need a People's Pledge for 2020. We're in the era of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is eliciting all across our country activists who are seeking to participate in this election cycle of 2020. Environmentalists, LGBTQ, women's groups, labor groups, all seeking to participate, all seeking to have their voices heard in this election cycle. And so, from my perspective, if they want to speak, they should be allowed to speak. No dark money, no hidden money at all. And their voices should be positive as well.
Senator, how
and
do you
that's
know?
that's the only way in which I think this should be conducted this year. But I will also say this, because I heard what the congressman said about the fossil fuel industry getting into this race. The fossil fuel industry spent millions of dollars to defeat me when I ran for the Senate for the first time. The fossil fuel industry believes that the Green New Deal is the existential threat to their business model, that their business model is to the planet. So they bitterly oppose me, they want to defeat me, and there are people all across this country who are ready to come in and to defeat me because they know the Green New Deal is, in fact, the answer to climate crisis on our planet. And so don't raise this issue of fossil fuels, because there isn't a fear that I have or anyone else has, and that's why the League of Conservation Voters has endorsed me, why the Sierra Club has endorsed me, why the Natural Resources Defense Council has endorsed me, why the Sunrise Movement has endorsed me, because they know they can trust me with the deepest aspirations about the climate crisis.
And a board member from ExxonMobil and fossil fuel lobbyists that have given you tens of thousands of dollars that you've only returned after you've been called out. And by the way, because those pledges aren't disclosed, you have no idea so whether that board member donated to you through that super PAC or anybody else for that matter. You have no idea where that money came from.
It has to be completely disclosed.
It hasn't been.
No dark money.
It hasn't been.
The Sierra Club knows what it's doing. They've looked at both of our records. The Natural Resources Defense Council looked at both of our records. The League of Conservation Voters looked at both of our records. The Sunrise Movement looked at both of our records. They all had a decision to make. They chose me in this race because they know that the Green New Deal is the vision for solving the crisis of the climate and unleashing millions of new jobs in order to accomplish that
I owe
goal.
you 30 seconds, Mr. Kennedy.
And Senator, if you care that much about the environment, you could have asked those supporters to donate against any one of the Republicans that we have to take out in order to actually act on the change that you believe, so that you say you believe in. But instead, you haven't. I did. That's the difference. No. And you can't sit here and say that we are going to address the systematic change that we need when the going gets tough. We have plenty of Democratic politicians that say the right things, and then when it comes down to it, that you fold up shop and say, you know what, back up the truck, we'll take whatever we can get.
Gentlemen, we are in the final minutes. We are in the final
Mr.
Markey, you've had a
minutes.
lot of time in this segment.
Right.
Gentlemen, we are in the final minutes of this debate. Marijuana quickly become a big business in Massachusetts. Just in Bristol County, nearly 40 licenses have been approved so far for retailers, growers, and manufacturers. Mr. Markey, you were still avoiding this issue as recently as last August when Boston.com reported your office didn't respond to a question about your position on recreational marijuana. Then just a few days after Mr. Kennedy got in the race, you co-sponsored legalization bills. When did you change your mind on legal marijuana?
45 seconds.
Well, I have supported legalization since it passed in Massachusetts.
Did you vote for it in the referendum?
Yes, I did. I voted to support legalization when it was on the ballot in Massachusetts.
Did you make that public?
And I made it public after it passed, but it was something that I came out publicly in favor before Congressman Kennedy did.
When did you come out publicly in favor of it?
And I believe that it is something that also, I might add, should be done in a way in which racial minorities, for the first time, should be able to fully participate in the business opportunities that marijuana is going to present in our state, and that we have to create a banking system that ensures that it's not a cash business, but something that goes through a traditional banking system.
Mr. Kennedy, as you know, some marijuana activists rolled their eyes at your own evolution on this issue because you had been against it and you came out for it the day the pot shops started opening. What changed for you other than that the politics had changed in Massachusetts?
45 seconds, Mr. Kennedy.
The status quo doesn't work. And look, I've been honest about my reservations with this that come largely from my work with mental behavioral health and addiction community and experts there that have a concern, particularly for youth and adolescents and exposure to marijuana. But the status quo has failed, period. And it's particularly failed for people of color. The criminal justice aspects of this we've known for a long time. And so I supported the MORE Act that expunges criminal records, decriminalizes marijuana, and actually makes the investments in communities of color. The difference here is that I've been clear about that position. Senator Markey back in 2013 said that he was actually against the decriminalization of marijuana because it would have trouble then, quote, policing it.
But you were against it at the time, too.
Yes, yes, but I've been clear about my position, and just so that we're clear on this, I came out for the legalization of marijuana over a year ago, long before Senator Markey signed onto those bills.
Okay, now each of our candidates get a 1-minute closing statement, the order of which was determined by a coin toss. Mr. Markey, you're first, your 60-second closing statement.
Thank you. Our country is right now confronted with multiple crises. The soul of our country is on fire. I know why I'm running for the United States Senate. I want to bring the values that I learned at the kitchen table in Malden, growing up with my father who drove a truck for the Hood Mill Company and a mother who had to work very hard as a young girl because her mother had died and she had to raise her 3 younger sisters. I'm running in order to make sure we have Medicare for all, that everyone gets it. I'm running to make sure that we have a Green New Deal so we can save this planet and create millions of new jobs. I'm running to make sure that we root out the racial injustice that's built into our economic system, health, educational, and criminal justice system in our country. I know that we must wage these fights. Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We have to put all of our hands on that arc and bend it together so that we fight for the soul of our country. I ask for the vote of the people of Massachusetts so that we can accomplish that goal.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Mr. Kennedy, your 60-second closing statement.
Thank you. You deserve more from your senator. This moment will not break us, but it will define us. This is our chance to build something better. Because at this moment, we know that our normal was broken. Normal is an essential worker that cannot earn a living wage. Normal is health care that the sick cannot afford. Normal is a system that allows black and brown lives to be taken in our streets. normal is a country that let George Floyd die. We can be so much bigger than this and so much better than it. But we will not deliver on that change with the same individuals and the same mindset and the same policies that have brought us the last 50 years. This moment can be the time that we make that change. I humbly ask for your vote.
I want to thank both of our candidates again for agreeing to participate in tonight's debate, and a special thank to the representatives of our debate partners who posed questions tonight. That's Dr. Robert Johnson, Chancellor of UMass Dartmouth, and Rebecca Hyman, an editor with the Gannett Newspapers of Massachusetts. And we want to thank our viewers for tuning in from Western Massachusetts.
The political tide has turned on the rising seas. We are reclaiming our leadership on the most important issue facing humankind. We can deliver a Green New Deal for America. This is an incredible moment. All of the supporters who are here today support the climate, clean energy, social justice, public health. We are talking about repairing the historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. The most powerful movement organizing in the United States today. Grassroots organization. We can deliver a Green New Deal for America. We can deliver wind, solar, offshore wind. It will only be through an historic, generational commitment to end climate change that we create the kind of democracy that works for all Americans. Never in our history have the interests of all Americans been so united. I want to thank my fantastic partner, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We will save all of creation. Our energy future will not be found in the dark of a mine, but in the light of